Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my updated tier list for Destined Rivals. Destined Rivals is the brand new set that has just released, and today I'm going to be going over where I think the metagame is currently standing. We have the North American International Championships for the competitive Pokemon TCG that is quickly approaching, and I bet many of you are getting ready for that tournament and want to know exactly where the standard competitive Pokemon TCG metagame is at. So, that being said, if you enjoyed the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. And also let me know if you agree or disagree or if there's something that I missed. But all right, let's hop into it here. We're going to hop into some of the new decks that I know many of you are wondering, are these decks actually good? Are these decks going to live up to the hype? Because there are plenty of new different archetypes. And, oftentimes when there's a new set that comes out, there's plenty of decks that get hyped up, and then they don't see a whole lot of success. So trying to figure out which ones are the real decks can sometimes be a little bit difficult. But I have been doing some testing with this new format and I have a pretty good idea of where things are standing. So starting off here, we got Mewtwo. This is a deck that I think is not as bad as what some people say. I think the main reason why this deck has potential is because Spidops is just a really powerful one prize attacker. I don't think the deck is terrible. Mewtwo is like average. I don't think it's an incredible attacker. You need 3 energy to hit for 280, which isn't necessarily super efficient. And also, your weakness to dark is very annoying because of the fact that Grimmsnarl is expected to see quite a bit of play. So I think it's like an average deck. I would probably put it at the top of tier C to the bottom of tier B. I don't think the deck is as bad as some people are saying it is, but I don't think it is necessarily a tier 1 deck to start off the format. Next up here, we got Grimmsnarl. Grimmsnarl is, in my opinion, the best new archetype out of the new set. I think it is quite good. I think it's currently at the bottom of tier A or top of tier B. I'm going to put it at the top of tier B. The issue that it has is that it does run into consistency problems. It is kind of difficult to actually find bench space for things like Pheasantipity. You don't really also have a draw engine as well in the deck, so you can sometimes run into consistency issues. But I do think the deck is pretty decent. You have a pretty solid Gardevoir matchup. Your Zoroark matchup is decent. Your Dragapult matchup is decent. Your Evolutions matchup isn't necessarily that great because a lot of them are playing the Leafeon. Your Bolt matchup isn't great. Your Joltik box matchup isn't great as well. So it does have some problems, but it does have a lot of comeback potential with things like Counter Catcher and Iono. Also having access to cards, like Budu as well. Being able to trap things and get lots of damage on the board with cards like Frostlass and also Monkey Dory. For my testing, it is pretty decent, but it does run into some consistency issues. So at the moment, we're going to put it at the top of tier B. Next up here, we have Dragapult. I think Dragapult is still pretty powerful. Gonna put it in tier A at the moment. I think, all the Dragapult, archetypes are still pretty solid. Kind of a similar deck in some ways to Grimmsnarl, where we're just trying to get a ton of damage on the board and set up multi-prize card scenarios. Also, great at making comebacks as well. I will say this is not the best deck in the format currently. I think that, Gardevoir is still seeing so much success in play, which, especially with the TM Evolution variant that saw success at the most recent Portland Regional Championships, that matchup is quite difficult for Dragapult to deal with. So the fact that those variants of Gardevoir are starting to see more success in play, make this deck a little bit weaker. Next up here, we have Raging Bolt. I think Raging Bolt is a phenomenal deck still very, very good. Has a pretty decent Grimmsnarl matchup as you have cards like Iron Leaves and also Tealmass Ogerpon, which do one-shot the Grimmsnarl, which is really, really good. So I do think that matchup is like pretty decent overall. Your Dragapult matchup is fine. Your Gardevoir matchup is really, really close. That's kind of like that 50-50 matchup, maybe slightly favored for Gardevoir. So, currently I have Bolt as one of the stronger decks in the format. I do think it's a little bit better than Dragapult, currently at the moment, just because I feel like Raging Bolt has a better chance against those TM Evolution Gardevoir variants. Next up here, we have Archaludon. I actually think that this deck is not too bad. I've played some games with it actually with the Team Rockets, bomb, being able to flip a coin. If heads, you get to put damage on their side of the board, and if tails, you put it onto your side of the board, which is not really that big of a deal because you have the Monkey Dory. I think this deck is actually kind of cool. I think it's a little bit underrated. It's just kind of inconsistent at times, and it doesn't have necessarily a really powerful draw engine as well. But when it does get going, and if you flip the right coin flips, it can be pretty good. Next up, we have Evolutions. I think Evolutions is really good right now. I have it as one of the stronger decks in the format. You pretty much have a chance versus everything. It's just whether or not your deck gets set up. So that's just, kind of the problem with it is it's a little bit, it feels a little bit chaotic at times because there's so many different moving parts. There's so many different options, that you have that it can sometimes, struggle with, actually being able to piece everything together to where, it can lose to matchups like Raging Bolt when it probably shouldn't. So yeah, that's kind of the problem that it runs into. However, it does have the Umbreon, which has been seeing some play recently, helps out in the Gardevoir matchup. Also has the Leafeon, which is starting to see some play in the deck as it hits weakness and one-shots a Grimmsnarl and also heals damage off your side of the board, which is really, really difficult for that deck to handle. So I think this deck is, pretty good. When it gets going, its matchup strat is really, really powerful. However, it can kind of hold itself back just by some of the consistency problems. Next up here, let's go over one of the, I guess, newer decks. We have Ho-Oh Macargo. Now, I actually don't think this deck is that bad. I'm going to put it in tier C. I don't think it's a bad deck. It's just, is it worse Raging Bolt? Like, is it really that special that you can use a one prizer that deals, a bunch of damage? Because you need to put a bunch of two prizers on the board to be able to attack with it. So I think that's one of the problems that it has. However, if you are able to get it set up, it can be quite solid. But there are a lot of decks that can throw, pretty decent one prizers into it and, kind of keep a solid prize trade versus it. So I don't think it's necessarily an amazing deck, but if it does get going, it can be pretty good. It can sometimes run into some consistency problems as well. But I think just like Ho-Oh in general is a really cool card, and I've been trying to make some cool rogue decks work with it. Next up here, we got Joltik Box. I think Joltik Box is a pretty solid deck at the moment. You have access to Iron Leaves, which helps out against Grimmsnarl. Your matchup against Dragapult is close. Your Gardevoir matchup is close. Your Raging Bolt matchup is tough. Just pretty much due to the fact that they have Slithering. But if they cut Slithering, the matchup swings, in my opinion. I think you're pretty okay against them if they don't have the Slithering. Your Eevee matchup is pretty close. I think it's pretty okay for Joltik. They can use things like Briar to take their final 3 prize cards, which can be kind of annoying. But if you can, create a board of just like multiple Pikachu, it can be a little bit difficult for them to be able to deal with that. So yeah, I think the deck is, pretty decent. There's just not necessarily a whole lot of outplay potential with the deck because it, pretty much, rinse and repeats the same strategy, over and over again. So it's, pretty well, like I would say, like it's pretty well expected, like you kind of know what to expect, from, Joltik Box. So that's, I guess, one of the problems with it. But I still think it's, pretty solid overall. Next up here, we're going to go over some rogue decks. I got Feraligatr and Fun, Typhlosion also in Fun. I know this deck has been, getting some talk, but just takes a lot of setup as well. You could potentially play it with the Poison package to deal, over 300 damage, which can be, kind of cool. But I just think it needs a little bit too much setup and not enough in return, I would say. We got Festival Leaves, the Porygon deck, being able to put lots of Porygons on the board and, like, deal crazy amounts of damage if you can actually set it up. But you got to get lots of Rocket supporters in the discard pile to actually be able to do that, which is kind of the issue. So I don't know. This card's just like, it's cool, but it takes so much to actually deal crazy amounts of damage. I would honestly rather just probably play Typhlosion. So yeah, that's an issue that I have with it. It just takes too much to get going. Okidogi, I think, is like a tier C deck. I don't think it's amazing, but it's okay. Having over, effectively 200 HP, dealing a lot of damage is pretty cool. Slowking I got in here. The Weezing deck as well. We'll put all of those at the bottom. Hydreigon. The Crobat deck is kind of cool, but I don't think it's necessarily super viable. Garchomp also goes in here. Slacking as well. I know that there's some Arch-Alodon, like Watchtower decks that are kind of cool, but I think Slacking is just a little bit too slow overall. Terapagos, I would say, is just a tier C deck, not necessarily overwhelming in any way. Has some pretty sketchy matchups as well, towards the top. Even things, like Grimmsnarl. I don't think the Grimmsnarl matchup is necessarily very good because you're getting into a, pretty much two-shot war against them, and Frostlass is just so powerful against that deck because they put down, multiple Bouffalants, their Noctowls. There's just so many things that just take so much damage that things get really, really rough after a while. Zoroark is not as good anymore. Shaman causes a huge problem for it. It turns a lot of matchups that used to be good into pretty sketchy matchups. Gardevoir is also playing Rabsca, so one of your strongest matchups isn't actually that good anymore. So I think that, Zoroark really, really falls off because Shaman pretty much turns a Zoroark deck into a deck that has trade, which is cool, and also Reshiram's attack. That's pretty much, all it is. Like, yes, you can use things, like Backdraft on the Darmanitan, but it's just, it takes away what makes the deck, special. So, and that's like another reason as to why, something like Terra Box isn't really expected to be a, top contender anymore, simply because things like the Torrential Pump on that Wellspring is what made the deck good. So kind of the same thing here where, this deck, yes, it does have, a couple other options, but it's just kind of becomes too linear now that Shaman exists. Got Hopzation, going to drop that down here. The Melodic Stall decks I don't think are great either. Blissey Tier C. Charizard, just like Charizard archetypes in general, I think are back. They're pretty good. Definitely pretty solid overall. Have been seeing some success in Japan, which has been kind of surprising. I was kind of like shocked to see. I was like, oh my gosh, like Zard's everywhere. But I guess one of the reasons as to why we're seeing Zard see success there is because of the fact that there is a side deck currently that is legal that stops Dusknoir from being used, which means that Dragapult gets hit pretty hard by that. On top of it as well, we see Grimmsnarl, which in my opinion does pretty decently against Dragapult too. Having to deal with that also is kind of annoying for Pult. So I think it's kind of created a lane for Charizard to, kind of see some success again, kind of have a place in the format where it really hasn't had a, top tier place in the format in quite some time. So that's like one thing. I think it's a solid B tier deck. I don't think it's that bad. And I would not be surprised to see it see success. There just are so many variants of Charizard now. There's, Charizard Noctowl. There's, Charizard Pidgeot. And then also with the Dusknoir. And then there also is the Dragapult Charizard variant, which in my opinion is the strongest one. Just, having access to that extra, draw power in that Dracoloak, and also having Phantom Dive is pretty cool. So yeah, I think Zard is pretty good. I definitely think it's going to be one of the stronger decks in the format. I don't think it's necessarily in the top 3, but, definitely in like that top 5 to 10 for sure. We got Goldango. I just don't think the deck is very good anymore. Its matchup spread is just not great. Like your Joltik matchup is tough. Your Bolt matchup isn't great. Your Eevee matchup isn't great. Your Gardevoir matchup is decent. Your Pult matchup isn't even, that great anymore too. It's just kind of an average deck. I don't think it's necessarily overwhelming in any way. So currently we have Goldango there. Next up we have Ceruledge. Ceruledge is just kind of like another Goldango, but in my opinion slightly worse because you don't have a draw engine. Gardevoir, I think, is tier A. I don't think there's any tier S decks. I know plenty of the tier lists that I post don't have a tier S deck. I think it would be kind of difficult to put a tier S deck at the moment. Heading into a new format, especially, like I would say if I was making this for, the previous formats that we just saw where, Gardevoir was winning, it seemed like pretty much every tournament, then yes, Gardevoir would be the S tier deck. However, we're going into a similar format. However, Grimmsnarl now exists, and Gardevoir does pretty well against everything except for Grimmsnarl. The Grimmsnarl matchup is not very good. So, currently we're going to put it as the strongest deck in the format. However, depending on how much Grimmsnarl we see, could kind of determine how good this deck actually stays. If there's not a whole lot of Grimmsnarl in the deck, struggles, then Gardevoir, there's a good chance it moves back up to S. However, if there's a lot of Grimmsnarl, then the deck I think could potentially move down, maybe to here. But currently it's just been seeing so much success in the previous format. I got to give it its flowers and put it in tier A. Roaring Moon Petrant, just another tier C deck. Don't think it's necessarily great. You can steal games with Petrant, which is kind of cool. Iron Thorn's Watchtower, I think it's okay. It's obviously very, very annoying for decks to deal with, but it can struggle with just like, linearity issues and just isn't necessarily an overpowering deck overall, but it's not too bad. We got Future Box, just would not play it, and then Ancient Box. I personally prefer the Dunsource variant over the one with the Great Tusk. But anyways, this is currently where I think the meta game is at. Let me know if you agree or disagree, or if there's any deck that I am missing. Feel free to leave it in the comments. But anyways, thanks as well also to Zapdos TCG for making this tier list template. Make sure to go check out their channel. But anyways, that's going to do it for me today. Thanks for all the support, as always. This is Smart TCG. I'll speak with you guys again soon. Peace out.